Welcome back to the Lubber's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. You are with Ian.
And with Mike.
And we are, bit by bit, reading our way through the Aubrey Matra novels of Patrick O'Brien. Mike, where had our wanderings got us to lately? Where are they going to take us this week?
Well, thanks, Ian. I think last week, I hope everybody enjoyed that reposting of the Crossing of the Line special on children. We couldn't leave Dill without revisiting that. And the week before that, we were in chapter 8. And you recall that was that long journey towards Kampong with the back and forth hopes about the envoy's health. And at the end, Mr. Stanhope died. Jack said they thought they'd come on a fool's errand, and Stephen quoted Dryden in reply, all of the piece throughout. Thy chase had a beast in view, thy wars brought nothing about, thy lovers were all untrue. And we were kind of left scratching our heads wondering, does this signal a new age for the surprise in our heroes the way the poem did for England, or is it simply futility? So I guess there's our setup. But this time, Ian, we're in chapter 9, and it's another amazingly long chapter. It's funny, Post-Captain was such a big book. Somehow Surprise seems to be a smaller book, but with a lot of bigger chapters. So this is chapter 9, part 1. The Surprise catches the China fleet, which delights everyone but Stephen. And later, Surprise sees a less hospitable squadron. Jack balances his desire for glory in action against his clear duty and rises to the occasion. Stephen provides an interesting commentary on the human race as Jack falls asleep, and we all wait for morning.
So we're going to find out what the New Age holds, at least a little tiny fragment of it, right?
Right.
And as O'Brien often does, he starts with a big picture, with a visual introduction to the chapter. And this is how the Surprise gets to confirm that the lights they had seen in the Middle Watch, again, starting a chapter with light, the lights they had seen in the Middle Watch are indeed the East India Company's China fleet. 39 ships, mostly country ships, namely British ships. They're all headed for India. There are foreign, that's to say non-British, registered ships that had tagged along for protection or to make use of the very precise navigation of the East Indiamen. 16 of these are the large East India Company ships that were going to sail directly from Canton to London. And we're going to hear a lot about these 16 ships and their outlook and their skill in these next 2 episodes. They are described as being in a formation that would not have done much discredit to the Navy. Stick a pin in that they could, for all intents and purposes, look like they were sailing like Navy ships. And there's this opening conversation between Stephen and the Reverend White. Reverend White had been chaplain to the envoy and was too impoverished to take an Indiaman home. He couldn't afford the fare after the envoy had passed away. So he's kind of riding as a supernumerary aboard the Surprise and assisting Stephen, as chaplains and parsons are wont to do. Anyway, this Reverend White is worried that these 19 ships in particular and this fleet are men of war. But Stephen says, and this is not the first and certainly not the last time that Stephen has flexed his knowledge of the Royal Navy and its doings perhaps beyond what is justified here. Oh, of course, he says, these are not men of war. There are small details that tell Captain Aubrey, and in parenthesis, other experts such as myself, there are small details that persuade you that this is not a huge enemy fleet. And the sort of counterpoint conversation to this is taking place up in the cross trees. Down on the deck, we've got Stephen and Reverend White. Up in the cross trees, we've got Pullings and a first voyager, a youngster by the name of Church, a little midshipman. Pullings names all the East India Company ships. By the way, this is nice for 2 things. First of all, more characterization for Pullings, who had to spend some time in his career already afloat with the East India Company. So he knows these ships and he knows their ways really well. And also, I like the fact that we're going to have the names of the ships called out, because much, much later on, we might get to talk about the correspondence between the events of these two episodes and what happened in real life. If you're taking care of the names of the ships, then that's a good thing. So Pullings points out how easily some of these heavier, more kind of professionally looking, naval looking ships might be mistaken for heavy frigates. However, he says the big difference is in the crew. These merchantmen have crewmen from India and Southeast Asia, known in naval slang as lascars. And he says they sometimes forget their ABCs, they sometimes forget their basics when it comes to moving quickly, and they're witnessing this right now. The big company ships, Pulling says, are called 1,200-ton ships, even though some are 1,500-ton, and very reasonably little church goes well. Wouldn't it be simpler to call them what they actually are? Besides all of this kind of obscurantism about the measurement of the size of the ships, Pullings completely waves this off. He says, it would never do. You don't want to be upsetting the old ways. Oh, dear me, no. God's my life. If the captain was to hear you carrying on in that reckless Jacobin democratical line, why, I dare say he would turn you adrift on a 3-inch plank, with both your ears nailed down to it, for to learn you bashfulness, the way he served 3 young gentlemen in the Med. No, no. You don't want to go arsing around with the old ways. The French did so, and look at the scrape it's gotten them into. So... Great job for Pullings, the man of the bygone age here.
Right.
What?
Right.
Call a 1,500-ton ship a 1,500-ton ship? Are you some kind of Democrat?
Right. It's funny, but it's such a great example. This idea about setting aside some of the old ways for the better ways, the new ways, and the misguided resistance to doing so. A big theme in this chapter, and one we've seen earlier in the canon.
Right.
So watch for it later as Jack kind of runs into one of those situations where necessity, really is the mother of invention. Some new ways are embraced, others are dismissed for reasons as weak as Pullings, equating, changing the naming of ship tonnage to the French Revolution and its impacts here. But we have so often commented on how Jack and Stephen and Sophie and Diana sometimes get caught in the old ways, or they fear a reproach, or they, it's not proper for a man to do this or for a woman to do this. And how often we're saying, please do what's needed. Well, now we've got that whole situation mirrored at sea, this chapter. Well, Pullings had called Church up into the tops because he kept hearing the midshipmen complain this whole voyage that all this, wealth of the Orient that he'd heard so much about leaving England on his first voyage, he'd never seen. He didn't really care much for the Orient so far. And the Chinese fleet, Tom's telling him, that reflects that wealth. Tom says to him, 6 million of money. God love us. What a prize. And I think, we're seeing O'Brien's artful little putting all these little things here, setting up what's coming here. Now, they're not only a great prize, it turns out that these company ship captains are really well paid. And we've had that come up before as well. And therefore, they're the most hospitable souls afloat, O'Brien writes, especially to the Royal Navy ships. They're protectors. So as soon as they see the surprise, all these signals break out on the head ship, that the Commodore ship, the Lushington. One requests the honor of surprises captain and officers to dinner. Please come with us. We see you there. And the other signals going out to all these other ships in this extended fleet, calling for all pretty young female passengers to please come join the flagship, if you will. It's not really the flagship, the Lushington, to entertain the guests at dinner. So here we have it, setting up the scene.
I love how a signal says, repeat young, repeat pretty, because for all the East India Company is a different world. They know what's going to make naval officers happy. And like you'd expect, I guess this is outwardly, it's a very happy dinner. Everybody's swapping news about what's been going on in the different parts of the world, what's happening with the war. There's gossip, there's riddles and toasts to the Navy, toasts to the Honorable East India Company, to trade's increase, which gets them all cheering. And everyone encourages the surprises men as well, who are on naval rations for most of their time, to really dig into this really lavish feast. There's splendid food. There's charming wine. Church, bless him, is overcome by the whole uh, physicality of the occasion. He overeats just out of kindness, out of consideration for the spread, and lays into all the extra desserts along with the woman sitting next to him. And this almost kind of does for him in the end. The ladies withdraw, followed by guess who? Young Mr. Babington decides that a female company is in the offing. And meanwhile, as the dinner sort of draws to the end of at least of this part of the dinner, the surprises surgeon, that's Maturin no less, is moody and silent as he sits there. And Mike, for a very brief moment, we have to wonder what's up with Stephen. But they row back to the ship, and quietly, privately, in the cabin with Jack, he gets to say what's on his mind.
Yeah, back on the Surprise, Jack is stuffed. He's delighted to be back in the Surprise's main cabin now that the envoy and his party are gone. So he and Stephen are back in the big cabin here. And he says he's especially happy to be rid of what he calls that wicked little scrub Atkins. We remember the envoy's secretary. And Stephen says, well, Atkins was weak, but he wasn't wicked. And Jack chides Stephen for what he calls finding too many excuses for scrubs. And he says, you remember Scriven, and we do from Post Captain. Jack holds Scriven up as an example and underscores, says, I always end up paying the price for these scrubs that, you're finding too many excuses for here.
Yeah.
Well, coffee comes in and Jack praises the meal that they just ate, especially the duck. And Stephen says, well, you should not have had 4 helpings of that melancholy meat and its rich sauce. It's just not the thing for a man in your condition. It's an invitation to apoplexy. Stephen says he signaled Jack to stop, multiple times, but Jack ignored him. And Jack asked if that's why Stephen was so silent, or as Jack said, mumchance, at dinner. So as you said, Ian, we're getting a little insight, but we're still not there yet.
It's funny. I love this next speech. So let's get the speech out and we'll talk about where it might come from. Stephen describes how unhappy he had been with his neighbors, the people sitting either side of him at dinner. Jack says, what? You mean the nymphs in green? Delightful girls. And Stephen comes right back up at him with both barrels. It is clear, this is Stephen now to Jack, it is clear you have been a great while at sea to call those sandy-haired, coarse-featured, pimply, short-necked, thick-fingered, vulgar-minded, lubricious blockheads by such a name. Nymphs, forsooth. If they were nymphs, they must have had their being in a tolerably rank and stagnant pool. And he goes on to criticize their bad breath, their bad teeth, their badly kind of showy dresses that were matching, flaunting false deceptive tops. It bespeaks, he says, a superfetation of vulgarity, both innate and studiously acquired. And when I think that their teeming loins will people the east, and he trails off. And I love this, Mike, partly because this is the classic Stephen, adjective stack here, partly because this is the kind of thing that's normally directed at Mrs. Williams. It seems to me like he can't have Diana, at least for the time being, and he's glum and fed up with the world and his own romantic fortunes. And to sit him next to somebody as coarse and licentious as these two women just kind of sets him off. Anyway, he talks about a superfetation of vulgarity. This is actually a medical or a zoological term that refers to a second conception during pregnancy. So you're already pregnant and the female, whatever it is, female human, female other mammal, fertilizes another embryo and it gets implanted again, resulting in multiple embryos at different stages in the womb. And so he's talking about this vulgarity that they have, this innate and studiously acquired vulgarity being two different kinds of vulgarity growing in the same being. And Mike, it says a lot about how disordered Stephen's thinking is about women and romance and flirting that he gets so offended. Earlier on, he was very willing to be tolerant, right? He was telling Jack off for calling Atkins a scrub. but he's perfectly happy to lay into these two girls here.
Yeah, and we can't help but still wonder, it's like you said, okay, we know, things are tense with Diana and everything else. Really, is that all that's going on? And
Right.
then O'Brien finally lets us in. He tells us that Stephen didn't tell Jack that these young ladies' first topic of conversation was Mrs. Villars of Bombay. This dreadful
Mm.
adventuress, not at all good looking, like people had said, and that people are obligated to receive her and pretend not to know about her situation with her gentleman friend, with whom she lives in the highest of style because of her friend. Now they said her friend, much more genteel. You would almost think he was one of us, the women said. So, Stephen's getting it with both barrels here,
Yeah.
their attitude towards Diana, their attitude towards Canning. And now Stephen's thinking, I wonder if I should be apologizing to Jack for my lack of candor. I wonder if I should tell him that these women spoke malignantly about Diana Villars, who I've asked to marry me and whom I expect to receive an answer from in Calcutta. But as he's thinking about this, Jack cuts off Stephen's thoughts, saying, well, sounds like you didn't altogether like your neighbors. And Jack's off to the next topic. Unlike us, Jack's not picking up on that. Wait a minute, this is not quite like Stephen typically. What's going on here? No, he moves right on.
He does, and he says it. He found a very congenial companion in Muffet, who's the commander of the Lushington and is therefore the commodore of the China fleet. And again, watch out for this. It's going to be important, this high regard that Jack has for Muffet and for some of the ships that he commands and the way that he commands them. Muffet, in Jack's eyes, is a thoroughgoing seaman, a step above the level that he normally expects from East India Company commanders. They both have this same idea about this bizarre arcane thing to do with stepping the royal mast abaft the top gallant. It never come up in conversation before, but Jack is adamant that this guy's got the right idea. Muffet had already done this particular adjustment to his rig and gained an extra knot, with promising as well to send Jack and Stephen's letters home by the packet as quickly as possible. Stephen says, well, I wish that you could have asked Sophie just to come straight to Madeira. And again, we'll hold that thought for later on. Back to Jack's esteem for Muffet, we get onto an even more important subject in the world of Jack Aubrey, which is gunnery. Jack really likes Muffet's ideas on this. He likes the way he exercises his people, even though they are pretty pitifully equipped in terms of manpower, but also in terms of the guns. And Stephen says, well, that Lushington seems to have more guns, actually, than the Surprise herself. And Jack puts him right. They're not guns, they're cannonades. Jack describes this as an unlucky bastard cross between carronades and cannons. They're unreliable at 500 yards, even unreliable at 50 yards. And as for manpower, while these ships have only 140 men, mostly Lascar cooks and stewards, not the 350 seamen that will be needed to serve them all and fire them all in action. And Jack's final thought on all of this is, dear Lord above, what a way to trundle 6 millions around the world.
So 2 days later, on a misty, heaving sea, Jack has his crew stepping his royal mast just like Muffet had done. He stopped their grog that day to be sure that they get it right. Everybody's silent and tense as the heel comes down, and they let out a universal sigh once it's done. Jack looks up at the mast with its promise of elastic strength and feels a dart of pure joy, O'Brien tells us, not only for the mast and the sweet motion of the Surprise, as he says, his own dear ship, but even more for being in command and afloat. So Jack is loving this. The lookout announces a new sail, maybe two on the larboard bow, and he's hesitant to report the China fleet a third time because he really should have seen him much earlier, but he was so caught up in watching the mast go up. Well, no one pays any attention because grog is about to start serving out as soon as they finish clearing away, all the mess here. So they're busy with that. But Jack and the first lieutenant look over at this hazy ship, which appears unnaturally large for being 4 miles away. And Staunton remarks that one of the ships that's now coming into view seems very old-fashioned, carrying his mizzen topmast staysail under his maintop. There, he's saying, I really can't believe the fleet caught up with us so quickly. I can already make out a few more ships behind them. And Jack realizes, wait, that's not the China fleet. It's Linois. And he breaks into a series of rapid commands, changing rigging, changing course, calling out the Marines. Babington comes running just as fast as he can, and the ship makes a heavy roll at the same time. So Babington slides right into Jack's feet. And Jack tells him he's carrying a proper deference a little too far, sliding there at his feet. Babington sees the mad brilliance in the captain's eye and asks him, what's afoot? And Jack, sums it up for us all. Linois is afoot, said Jack with a grin.
Now then, now everybody's pulse starts to beat a bit faster. But without spoiling too much, I think I can say our rate of pulse increase is going to be managed very steadily and very cleverly by O'Brien in this situation here. Jack then turns to First Lieutenant Sturton and says, okay, he's going to give him instructions on how to do this Cochrane/Jack Aubrey style. He says, we're going to send up preventers and backstays. We're going to send up all the extra sail that we might need to be ready in the tops, the stunsails and the kites. That means that whenever I ask for it, we can have all the sail we can carry. And he also says we're going to prepare to clear for action. Up to the masthead goes Jack Aubrey with his telescope. Meanwhile, the Surprise, under his orders, has spun round on her heel and is now close hauled, heading north, flinging a fine, wide bow wave. Jack sees the two Frenchmen who had been sailing on a course designed to intercept them turn to follow. Beyond them is a larger ship, and there's another farther southwest, perhaps a brig, thinks Jack, on the blurred horizon. It's clear that this, obviously French, squadron has been sailing in line abreast, strung out to sweep 20 miles of ocean, very similarly to how the British fleet was strung out to capture the Spanish treasure ships at the end of Post Captain. That's another story. They've been in line abreast, looking for the slow China fleet. And the China fleet, of course, is due to get back to this very same spot the next day. So Jack hasn't got the challenge of fighting and defeating the French. He hasn't simply got the challenge of self-preservation against a superior force. He's got the challenge of finding a way through the situation so that he can protect the China fleet, either by helping the French not discover them or by helping make sure that the encounter happens on his terms. Now, there's a really nice mapping and layout and commentary on the way this action evolves, which we will share on social media. Reader Charles Keller has laid out in this particular analysis on the web all the positions and wind and movement of the ships that are involved in this encounter. I will give you a spoiler alert that the same web write-up, if you follow the link that we put on our socials, it also covers events that are due to happen in the second half of the chapter, which is next week's episode. But if you're okay with those kind of spoilers, you might really like this site. It was recommended by a good friend, Tom Horn from Cannonade.net. So watch out for our socials, and then you can take advantage of this. We also think, if this is right, Mike, this is the first time that cannonades are mentioned here. It might even be the only time. I can't think of many other occasions when anybody's mentioned cannonades. But I guess that was the inspiration for the naming of Tom's website, Cannonade.net. Nice job. Once again, Mike, we're talking here about resources and ideas and great bits of support and extension that have been pulled together by Aubrey fans going all the way back to the listserv days back in the 1990s, back to the origins of O'Brien fandom. It's great that it's all still out there and it's all, there for us readers to help explore and understand what's going on in the canon.
Well, Jack hears a gun in the distance, and he figures it's probably Admiral Linois calling in his Lewis ships. He orders the Dutch ensign raised, along with 2 or 3 hoist of the first signal flags that come to hand. In other words, let's confuse them here a little bit. The Surprise is drawing away from the 2 French frigates, who are both cracking on themselves, one making 8 knots, the other 9. And Jack at this point just wants to learn exactly what they're dealing with here. He watches the Surprise is down below. He's still up in the tops. and they're preparing for battle. And he's thinking, well, this is the first time they've actually done it in earnest. They've prepared many times, but never to go into real action here. And that makes him think, how are they going to behave in real action? He feels good about it, but wants to see here. This second frigate, the 36-gun Semillon, has got 12 pounders on her main deck, and it passes the first frigate, the 40-gun Belle Poule, with 18 pounders. And I think, Ian, we talked about the Belle Poule and the inspired French hairstyle in the Commodore. So,
Yeah.
here's one from an action like, I think, the 1780s, 1790s, back with the hairstyle, still here. But, the frigates, both of the French frigates, well handled, but somewhat crank, slow, probably, Jack thinks, from this great curtain of weed that's grown in these warm waters that they've been in over the last year here. Now, a midshipman reports to Jack that the ship is cleared for action and wants to know if the captain chooses to be to quarters. Jack says, I don't. He's thinking to himself, I don't want to keep the men waiting by their guns longer than we need to. He orders the sails discreetly reduced and an old foretopsail bent to a hawser and veered out of the lee stern port to act as a drag sail. So we've got all of Jack's little tricks starting to come into play here.
Yeah. Jack is hoping to deceive Lenoir, and in passing, he's also deceiving poor old Reverend Mr. White. So we get back into this conversation between Stephen and Mr. White. Mr. White says, these ships chasing us, they seem to be getting closer. And he borrows Stephen's glass, takes a look. He says, they're flying English flags. Congratulations on our deliverance. We are saved. And Stephen replies with this nice little Latin phrase, Hod crede colori. No idea if the pronunciation's anywhere close there. But it literally means, don't trust the color. And he goes on to explain by asking White to look up. Looking upwards, White sees that the Surprise herself is sailing under false colors. Stephen goes on to explain this whole situation to them. The French, just like the English in this situation, are sailing under false colors. It's a ruse de guerre. It's often done at sea. And knowing, I think, or realizing very astutely what kind of slightly mannered, slightly middle class, slightly bourgeois person the Reverend White is, he says, well, it's a little bit like telling the servant, and we don't get to find out yet what he was going to tell the servant, because now the shot starts to fly. A shot from the Semillon splashes just short of the frigate's stern. White gets frightened at this. And Stephen goes on and says, well, yeah, this ruse de guerre thing is a bit like telling a servant to say that you're not at home when you are in fact eating a muffin by the fire and don't want to be disturbed. And I think White clearly feels a bit skewered by this because he realizes, I often did so, said Mr. White, whose face had grown strangely mottled. God forgive me. And now here I am in the midst of battle. Almost as if there's like payback for his sin of misleadingly sending a visitor away is that he has to stand and endure cannon fire in battle. He's obviously a very dramatically inclined, self-regarding kind of a guy. Meanwhile, another shot comes in, strikes the top of a wave, lands on the quarterdeck, and the cannonball is grabbed by two midshipmen. Good heavens, cried Mr. White, to fire great iron balls at people you have never spoken to. Barbarity has come again. And I love the line. People who... I haven't been introduced to these people and they're firing at me. How can that possibly be? Stephen is very genteelly helping White manage his anxiety here. Would you like to take a walk, he asks. And Mr. White realizes that he ought to set a good example for the crew. He would therefore like to walk, he says, unless the doctor thinks that he should stand there on the quarterdeck to show that he doesn't care for these ruffians. He asks Stephen then if the captain is going to remain in his exposed position up high on the top in the mast. Stephen says, I dare say he will, turning the situation over in his mind. And Mike, in the previous chapter or two, we got all this perspective on how things are different at sea versus how they are on land. And Mr. White is another little hostage from the land-based civilized world to remind us that things at sea, at least Navy fashion, are different than they are back home in the vicarage.
Right, including his theology. I love
Yeah.
that. It's all brought a little at home to him here. Well, Stephen had said he thinks Jack's up there turning the situation over in his mind, and that's exactly, of course, what Jack is doing. He knows that his first duty after reconnoitering the enemy is to reach the China fleet, as you said, Ian, and do everything possible to preserve the fleet. He knows he can outsail the Frenchmen, especially, he thinks, since I'm in a ship that they built, but I'm sailing it. As the text says, it stood to reason an Englishman could handle a ship better than a Frenchman. Even a French ship, of course. I like it. But Jack thinks Lenoir, the fox, had caught him before and is not to be underestimated.
Ooh. Mike, there's some jeopardy building here. Jack is a bit foxy, but we believe so is Lenoir. So while these two are trying to outwit each other, and while Stephen and Mr. White are trying to figure out what's really going on, maybe this is a good moment to send the hands for some grog and take a quick break. What do you think?
I think it's a brilliant idea. We're back, and the two-decker is nearer. It's the Marengo, a 74 with a rear admiral's flag. So this is the flagship. This is Lenoir's ship. She had worn rather than tacked, Jack noticed. And he thinks to himself, Lenoir is favoring his flagship. The Berceau, a 22-gun corvette, follows the Marengo along with an unknown brig, and the Marengo, the Berceau, and the brig stand on the opposite tack to cut the surprise off if the two French frigates can head the surprise by running alongside her like greyhounds chasing a hare. As their shots get closer, Jack has a reef shaken out of the foretopsail. So yeah, I want to not be too fast. I want to deceive him with our speed, but I don't want to get hit either.
So, with the reef shaken out, the Surprise gains some speed. She leaps forward, and the Semillante, which is clearly the faster of the two French vessels, is leaving her consort, the Belle Poule, far behind. Jack knows that he can lead the Semillante on, and then, if he chooses to, bear up suddenly, bring her to action, and possibly sink or take her, which I guess this is a twinge of regret here. She's the only prize in the Indian Ocean that's kind of his size and weight that he could actually take on, but he's going to have to sink her, perhaps. He could do this damage to her anyway before the others all come up. With this prospect of prize taking and saving the East India Fleet, his breath comes up short. He's thinking about the glory, not just the money. He's thinking about the glory of going into action, and his heart slows again as he thinks about the prospect of battle damage. He knows that being as far as he is from friendly ports, he can't endanger a single spar. So it's his clear duty to do what he's got to do and then rejoin the China fleet at once. Now, on the present course, Lenoir and his squadron is headed straight for where the unsuspecting Indiaman will be in half a day's time, sailing due east. Jack needs to lead the French ships away and use a lame duck ruse, even if he loses the weather gauge, so that then he can turn back in the darkness, climb up to windward, and reach the convoy in time. But Lenoir might have the two frigates continue north, and for them to, for their sake, gain the weather gauge. If that happens, there will be a gap in about a quarter of an hour, a gap in the French line that Surprise could turn and dart through, passing between the Belle Poule and the heavy flagship, the Marengo, which would show them an unexpected turn of speed from the Surprise. The corvette might close the gap, but can't hang on to the Surprise unless her commander is willing to have his ship sunk. So there's a question here then of just how bloody and courageous is the French commander. Jack's mulling all over this, wondering what's in Lenoir's mind. Jack thinks that Lenoir is much more concerned about catching the China fleet and those 6 million of money than he might be about destroying one frigate. But all of this depends on knowing what Lenoir thinks his mission is and knowing what Lenoir might suppose about what's over the horizon.
Well, Jack comes back down on deck, and Stephen sees that Jack has his battle face on. And O'Brien tells us it's not the glowing blaze of immediate action, like he would have if he was boarding or cutting out, but he describes this as a remoter, cheerful, confident, withdrawn expression filled with natural authority. Jack paces the quarterdeck, only speaking to order preventer backstays doubled. Yeah, and Stephen sees the first lieutenant approach Jack, hesitate, and then step back. And he notes to himself, Jack appears to have gotten bigger. He's swelling physically, he's swelling spiritually. He thinks, I wish I could measure this. I wish I could actually get, a true measure of these changes. Jack is like a stranger right now. Even I think, Stephen, even I would be hesitant to address him when he looks like this. Wow.
And it's like the character of Jack Aubrey as a fighting captain kind of growing before Stephen's eyes. It's really, really great. Jack, still very much in command, still thinking fast, tells Sturton to have the surprise go about, but do it slowly and to keep the drag sail. The French frigates then start to follow, but the flagship signals them to continue north, giving a clue that Linois is after the bigger prize here. The Belle Poule's turn is too far along, however, even when the order from Linois is emphasized with the gun. So he has to complete a 270-degree turn to complete his turn here. This cuts this precious gap that Jack had been depending on by a quarter of a mile. And to maintain his cool here, Jack asks the midshipman church to go and bring him a mango, because nothing says fighting captain like eating fruit, right?
Yeah, Jack's sitting here, sussing out the situation, juice running down his chin. He watches the frigates cross the Surprise's wake. Now they've got the weather gauge. And Jack thinks, well, I'm definitely committed. He sees the Marengo's 2 tiers of guns, the 74 here, as she sails a parallel course. And after some time, Jack tells Sturton to prepare to drop the drag sail, set all the sails as quickly as possible, and to bring the wind 2 points on the Surprise's quarter when Jack signals. So Jack has got this thing, he knows his plan. He's waiting for the exact moment. He's setting everything up here. He starts to whistle, and then he realizes, wait a minute, too much wind's going to favor the 74. That's the way Linois caught me last time. So stops whistling. And he waits, and when the forces are exactly balanced, he throws his hairy mango stone over the side and orders, let go there, hard a port. And the Surprise once again turns on her heels. The sails change out immediately. The ship jumps this time, and her masts groan. Jack commends Sturton on this excellent execution, and they're headed straight for Jack's targeted spot, quickly reaching a speed of 11 knots. So far, so good.
Yeah, it's pretty brisk. All of Jack's seamanship seems to be paying off so far. They seem to have succeeded in catching the Marengo unawares, but she recovers. She sets a course to intercept the Surprise and sends the other ships also after the Surprise. Jack, aware of all the different superstitions that might be influencing his situation here, touches a belaying pin while saying, well, they'll never succeed. They didn't send up double preventer backstays half an hour ago. They, therefore, won't be able to carry royals in this breeze, unlike the Surprise. But despite that, the Marengo and the Belle Poule are still converging fast. He needs to stay out of the 2-mile reach of their long guns and out of the particularly deadly overlap between the fields of fire of their 2 sets of guns. He needs another knot of speed to be sure. So he takes another look at Surprise's trim. He makes some changes. The strong new royal mast that he's put up there appears to provide the speed that he needs, but the Marengo is still crowding on sail. So racing into that dangerous overlap zone, Jack takes down his Ruse de Guerre. I think they were Dutch colours. He raises the ensign and he raises his pennant that says he's a commissioned ship of the Royal Navy. He needs to take a precise measurement of what their speed is. So he orders the quarterdeck crew to stream the log. The logboard tears away downwind, tearing the line clean off the reel. Jack's only seen this once before, and he has to go again with a measurement of the speed here. Meanwhile, the Marengo fires. The Marengo's ball skips and falls short. The next shot is farther away. They are through. They've made it through the gap. Jack doesn't want to discourage Linois from chasing him, so he tells Sturton to ease the sails off to reduce speed a little bit, start signaling as if there were allies in sight. This signal is going to say, enemy in sight, ship of the line, corvette and brig bearing east, 2 frigates bearing north-northwest, request orders with a signal emphasis gun fired every 30 seconds to maintain the appearance that Jack has got some allies just over the horizon. This all seems to be working out. Jack realizes that the French corvette had changed direction in the turning wind and in the squall that came. She's now half a mile to the west. If the commander of the corvette is willing to withstand Surprise's raking fire, back to the estimate that Jack was making earlier on of the character of the commander here, if the commander is willing to risk his ship, he can bring the Surprise to action. Jack, on the other hand, really wants just to maintain the cat and mouse here. He wants to lead Linois on, take him far to the southward before nightfall. And knowing that he's about to come into action with the corvette, he has Babington get ready with a deceptive maneuver. He says, arrange the main topsail to look like it's come down when I give the order, so that when he gets into action with the corvette, he can make like he's been more heavily damaged than he might actually have been. It must, he says to Babington, look like bedlam, but be ready to set again. So, Mike, all of Jack's seamanship, all of his preparations, all of his ruses are ready to spring here, I think.
Right. Well, the Berceau comes down as fast as she can, but she doesn't fire. Babington finally signals to Jack that he's ready. Surprise beats to quarter. Stephen leads the chaplain below to assist him, in his operating room there. And he gives White a bucket to use for himself, since he learns that White has never seen blood spilled in any quantity. So here's your tools and materials for the men. Here's a bucket for yourself here. And the Berceau continues, just keeps coming right on into the certainty of this murderous raking fire. It's really much more determination than Jack had reckoned on. Jack orders a steady, deliberate fire pointing low at her foremast. They put a hole in her spritsail. The corvette answers with a chaser shot that strikes the Surprise's mainmast a glancing blow. Surprise's rippling broadside holds the corvette's bows, chains, and foresail. As the range narrows, Surprise continues to hit her hard with every shot and sweep her deck from stem to stern, dismounting 2 cannons. Her way is checked, but she comes on and then sends chain shot through the Surprise's rigging. Jack orders Grape for his next round, but a cheer cuts him off. The corvette's foretopmast goes and falls over the forward guns.
Wow. So this is starting to turn into some real action here. It turns out that the French commander did have the stomach for a bit of a fight. Jack calls for Babington's ruse to come into play. Let the maintop go, he says. It collapses. The corvette cheers, thinking that she's done some damage to the Surprise. A hail of grape from the Surprise, meanwhile, knocks away a dozen men on the Berceau, and Jack curses, telling the men to cease fire, and he calls on them to start knotting and splicing. And this is a little humane moment for Jack. That was unnecessary, all that bloodshed aboard the French ship. All he needed to do was harm her rigging and prevent her from doing what she's going to do next. And this humane attitude from Jack continues as he takes off his hat and salutes the French captain over on the bloody quarterdeck. The Frenchman returns the salute, but the Frenchman's larboard guns do still, in any case, fire a ragged broadside in one last attempt to stop the Surprise. Jack is now well ahead of the French. He sees that there's now only about an hour left to lead the French away before the moonless night finally falls. He orders another deceptive signal. Signal partial engagement, heavy damage, request assistance, enemy bearing north-northeast and north-northwest. And, of course, this is the fictitious signal to a fictitious Royal Navy ally, but never mind, he's maintaining the pretense here. He continues with a half-minute signal gun and asks Sturton to make it look like there's a fire in the waist. He suggests by lighting a copper filled with slush. So even more Cochrane-style Aubrey antics going on here to give the appearance that the Surprise has taken some damage. The French brig goes to help the Berceau that's been badly knocked up by the surprise, just as the Marengo and the two heavier French frigates come after the surprise. The Belle Poule, trying to keep herself in the chase, sets her main royal, and it instantly carries away with a little victory there for all the double preventer stays from Jack from earlier on. Now, Mike, we've had busy times and kind of fine naval tactics on deck. What's been going on down below?
Well, it's interesting. Jack goes down to check, and Stephen reports really surprisingly few casualties. Mr. Callow was hit on the head by a block. Jack seems sorry to hear that Callow won't require trepanning. He was kind of like, oh, good. Yeah, you're going to open his brain again here. But Mr. Jenkins is there, and he holds up a wickedly sharp 2-foot piece of wood. And Stephen says, with Mr. Jenkins, another 20th part of an inch, and it would have pierced an artery, making Jenkins an involuntary hero. Jack congratulates Jenkins for the close call. And, I think I'm in my own mind, Ian, thinking, well, that's a nice echo of Surprise's close call. We came a lot closer than I think we were expecting to being an involuntary hero. Let's hope that doesn't happen again. Now, Jack notices that Reverend White is unconscious, and he's, Stephen, oh my gosh, what happened to the Reverend? And Stephen, says, well, it surprised us all. We only asked him to hold up a man's scalp while Stephen and his mate reattached it. There was virtually no blood, says Stephen, but somehow the Reverend passed out anyway. So, a little moment of O'Brien humor to get us through here.
It's great, isn't it?
Well, on deck, the smoke is belching. Babington is roaring and cursing in the waist. Swabs and the fire engine are running back and forth. And everybody is looking, thankfully, unseen by the enemy, slightly pleased and sly with their deception. So there's great production going on here. And the sun, meantime, sinks into the blood-red haze as the starless, moonless night sweeps in from the east. So another opening and closing O'Brien scene setting here. The French lights are visible far astern. Surprise sends up some blue lights and runs faster southwest. So we're moving here. We're wondering, is it working?
We get to midnight, and the Surprise hauls her wind in the pitch darkness, saying they need to get some sleep for tomorrow's busy day. Jack is sort of halfway through his deceptive maneuver here. He's counting on the cover of darkness to reach back with the convoy and do the next part of his protective maneuver. And Stephen asks, how successful has it been? Do you think Linois is deceived? Jack says he hopes he is. He'd certainly come after them as if he was, but he says he knows Linois is a deep old file, and Jack will be happy to see nothing but the China fleet in the morning. Stephen can't believe that the Admiral could, in his phrase, dart about and fling himself between us, guided by mere intuition, adding, by way of supporting evidence, that admirals are not seers, but he's lost his partner in this conversation because Jack Aubrey is asleep. And the chapter wraps up with Stephen delivering this nice speech to the completely comatose Jack Aubrey. Honest Jack, if you snore in that deep, pragmatical fashion, Sophie is going to spend many an uneasy night. It occurs to me, he said, looking at his friend, who, according to his long-established habit, had plunged straight into the dark, comfortable pit of sleep from which nothing would rouse him but the cry of a sail or a change in the wind. It occurs to me that our race must have a natural propensity to ugliness. You are not an ill-looking fellow, and were almost handsome, before you were so pierced, blown up, and banged by the enemy, and so exposed to the elements. And you are to marry a truly beautiful young woman. Yet, I make no doubt, you will between you produce little common babies, that mewl, pule, and roar, all in that same tedious, deeply vulgar, self-centered monotone, drool, cut their teeth, and grow up into plain blockheads. Generation after generation, and no increase in beauty, none in intelligence. On the analogy of dogs or even of horses, the rich should stand 9 foot high, and the poor run about under the table. This does not occur. Yet the absence of improvement never stops men desiring the company of beautiful women. Not indeed that when I think of Diana, I have the least notion of children. I should never voluntarily add to the unhappiness of the world by bringing even more people into it in any case. But even if that were in my mind, the idea of Diana as a mother is absurd. There is nothing maternal about her whatsoever. Her virtues are of another kind. He turned the wick down to a small line of blue flame and crept onto the steeply sloping deck, where he wedged himself between a coil of rope and the side and watched the dim, tearing sea, the clearing sky with stars blazing in the gaps of cloud, reflecting upon Diana's virtues, defining them, and listening to the successive bells, the responding cry of "All's well" right around the ship, until the first lightning of the eastern sky. End of chapter 9, part 1.
Wow.
Isn't that
Wow.
great?
I mean, from all this, action that's starting to Stephen's reflection here. Wow.
Yeah. And again, we're back with O'Brien's favorite vehicle for expressing kind of philosophical, poetic thought. We've got light, we've got flame, we've got clouds, we've got stars. It's a really beautiful moment. And he's still hopeful, right? Diana's virtues are of another kind. And how much of this is him rationalizing his misfortune in love with Diana? How much of this is him rationalizing his despair at the passing of Dill? Or how much of it is a combination of those?
Right.
We don't know.
Right. Masterfully, I think, for O'Brien to, in the midst of all this action, pull us right back there and remind us of all the things going on in HMS Surprise. But he's still, having done that so well, talks about this first lightning of the eastern sky. That's the last phrase. So it's like, okay, dawn's coming up. What do they find in the morning? Jack had said, I hope all we're going to see is the China fleet, where I hope it will be, where I expect it to be.
Yeah.
But other things could happen.
Right. I mean, the China fleet might have smoked Jack's ruses, because Linois, we know, is to use the phrase, a deep old file, either by good luck or by good judgment, or even by, some superior piece of seamanship. Linois might yet put himself in a place where Jack Aubrey's plans to defend the China fleet might not come to pass. And if Linois can isolate Jack and track him down in the night, well, that completely changes the story. Now, Stephen is doubtful that Linois can dart around out of sheer, prescience. But I think it's in Jack's mind that Linois is capable of quite a lot here.
Yeah. And then I wondered, in the midst of all that, in the midst of the action, in the midst of this hark back to Diana and Stephen, what were to make of Stephen's thoughts on man's lack of, I'll call it positive evolution. I don't know that that's all positive. That we haven't become better by breeding well, if you will. Now, is this telling us anything about what we might find in the morning? Is this reference to horses and dogs and rich people and poor people a bit of a red herring? Or is the point really about our natural propensity toward ugliness? Did O'Brien put it here to reflect on our appearance, or perhaps the ugliness of our character and how we treat each other? And does that tell us anything about what we might find at dawn?
Yeah. And light illuminates and light gives us perspective. So maybe the perspective of sunrise is the prospect of, some new insight into ourselves. Certainly, Stephen seems like he's trying to be very open and very philosophical about his situation. So who knows? Jack, on the other hand, I think is very, very single-minded. Jack's expectation is that if he can be granted a little bit of good fortune, and if all his seamanship and his navigation ruses come off, then he could yet save the day. But we've seen the opposite happen, right?
We have. Well, as usual, I think there's only one thing for it. What do you say? What do you say next week to a little bit more Patrick O'Brien.
With all my heart. It is clear you have been a great while at sea to call those sandy-haired, coarse-featured, pimply, short-necked, thick-fingered, vulgar-minded, lubricious blockheads by such a name.